Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And as thousands are gathering in Normandy, where I live, for the 79th anniversary of D-Day, today we are talking about an event that took place in June 1943. Eduardo Pagán joins me from Arizona State University on the 80th anniversary of the Zoot riots. And if you don't know what that is, you'll find out very shortly. Just before I bring Eduardo in, if you're new to the channel or if you're not new, please do remember to click subscribe. Only 60% of viewers are subscribed, so 40% of you have not yet subscribed. If you do that, you get all the notifications of the next live show. So that's it. Housekeeping out of the way. I'll bring Eduardo in. It's morning where you are. Good morning, Eduardo. How are you today? Oh, you're muted. Hang on.
Mark, right? So it's afternoon now.
Afternoon now. Okay, so my first question to you is, the Zoot riot is something I became aware of possibly via the Steven Spielberg film 1941, which is not the most academic of reasons, but that's probably my first reaction. I was 12 years old when that movie came out. But yourself, you study various aspects of social history, cultural history. When were you first aware of this, and was it part of a greater context?
Yeah, actually, I first came aware of this when I was a teen, as I recall. Curiously enough, there was a Broadway play, which then became a movie called Zoot. And, back in the day, and I'm talking about, I guess I was about, I don't know, probably about 15 or so. The number of movies that were really devoted to Latino or Mexican-American history were really quite rare. So this was an event. Everybody had to see this, right? And it revolved around the Zoot riot. And so that was my first exposure to it, was really this dramatic representation.
And as you will find out with your presentation, it's an event from my research that has been perceived different ways over the decades. And the historiography of it is as interesting in some ways as the events themselves. It's what it tells us about how these events were viewed then and how they were viewed through the 50s and 60s when changes were made in the society, and how they're viewed now. But yeah. Folks, we will do questions as we go along today. Eduardo has come armed with a PowerPoint. He'll tell me when to move on the next slides. But basically, I'm going to hand over to my guest, and we will sit back and learn about these events that, don't forget, folks, 80 years ago today, these events were commencing. So over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you so much. So I just to give you an overview. I think I've got about 23 slides that I want to show with you. Many of them are just pictures from the time period, but I'll try and contextualize them. And really kind of the two main things that I want to address is what happened.
Yeah.
Right. It's a curious riot to begin with. The name itself is curious, but even the way that it rolled out was very curious. So what happened? Beyond the dramatic representations that you can find, what's the story? And the second thing I want to try and explain is, why did it happen the way that it happened? All right. So next slide. Let's go ahead and do that. So I just want to acknowledge then that we're approaching now the 80th anniversary of the Zoot riot. It went on for about 5 days, as you can see the dates right there, from the 3rd to the 8th of June. And the riot itself was not this continuous act of violence that rolled out 24 hours. It often took place in the after hours, as the sun set and people kind of came out to socialize. This is when things happened. This is an actual photograph from downtown Los Angeles. So you can see a streetcar is being stopped. Somebody is standing on top of another car. The actual moment is that they were after young people wearing what was known as the Zoot suit. And I love this photograph. I don't know if you can make this out underneath where I put the 3 to 8 June. The folks in the car, they're looking back, like trying to figure out what the heck is going on. Why is everybody into the street? All right, so next slide then. So let me start off with then the question is, what is a Zoot suit, or what was a Zoot suit? So it was really part of this subculture of jazz. And to kind of put it into modern understanding, there are a lot of musical forms that come forward that are more than just the sound itself. It's an entire cultural package. So think about when hip hop hit the mainstream, right? Hip hop not only had a particular sound, but there was a particular way of dressing. And it wasn't just a way of dressing, it was a way of dancing, of moving the body as well. There was an attitude associated with jazz was the same way. When jazz rolled out of the Mississippi Delta starting in the 1920s, it was in its day an underground sound, and it was an underground culture. So the zoot suit itself was part of that fashion in the same way that a lot of bling was part of the fashion of hip hop, right? The suit itself was a part of jazz culture. You know, I believe that it was really the descendant of Edwardian fashion, but what made the difference was, now Edwardian fashion was the fashion of gentlemen, 1890s, 1910s, 1920s. I mean, right in that kind of period. What made the difference is that by the 1930s, when you start to see it, this is no longer the fashion of gentlemen. This is the fashion of working people who have kind of appropriated the fashion. And that's what gives it an entirely different spin, right?
Just to jump in very briefly, Eduardo, because when I was in the early 80s, because as soon as I looked at your slide set this morning, the Edwardian thing, because I was in the rockabilly and rock and roll scene. So when the Stray Cats came out, and we called Zoots, the drapes was what we called the suit style jackets, and we were called Teddy Boys, and there'd been Teddy Boys back in the 50s and Teddy Boys in the 70s. So obviously, this has a shared origin, like Latin language going out to become Spanish and Italian. There's obviously an Edwardian thing that went into rock and roll and rockabilly and went out to Los Angeles and this part of California earlier, but influenced the culture. And again, it was when I was in the scene in the 80s, the rockabilly scene, we called it Zoots. It was poor people. We were dressing well, but we had no money. It was all thrift stores. But I just add that cultural reference of my own youth.
Yes. As a matter of fact, the style itself has this very interesting, after the World War II period in the United States, jazz moves on to bebop, much more stripped down, and the fashion falls out in the United States, but continues on in the UK, which then kind of is the background of the Teddy Boy culture, right? So yeah, I mean, there's this very interesting global connection of this fashion. So let's go to the next slide then. All right. So here's what I want to say. If we went back in time, back to the 1930s, 1940s, in the United States, for many musical styles, there's always kind of an East Coast version versus a West Coast version. And the same thing can be found in jazz culture. What was known as a zoot suit in the 1940s was actually the drape. And it's fascinating that you use that term as well in the UK. On the West Coast, young people insisted this is not a zoot suit, it's a drape. And so you have a version of the West Coast on the right side of the screen. And as you can see, it's much, much more conservative than the East Coast version. The East Coast version was primarily written or worn by African Americans, but you had some immigrant Americans also wearing the fashion. So Italians, Jews. The difference is that the East Coast was much more flamboyant. So you can see from the hats, for example, just the brim is so much larger than what it is today. You have the buffalo plaids. Even though these are black and white, there are a lot of description of these colors being these lime.
You can imagine the colors, can't you? Yeah.
Right. Lime greens, bright yellows. Whereas in the West Coast, they're all grays, browns, and blacks. And even the cut is much more conservative, right? So again, I just want to note that if we went back to the 1940s and you looked around in California and asked, where's a zoot suit? First of all, people would be upset with the term, but it was a much more conservative style. But nonetheless, and this is what I find so fascinating, variations in style can make all the difference in how it's interpreted by the public. Minor variations in style. So let's go to the next slide. So let me kind of walk you through the zoot suit, right? And this is the overview. So on the 3rd of June, 1943, the fighting begins in the downtown Los Angeles area. I'll show you a map in just a moment. What happens in the subsequent nights is that as rumor begins to spread through the military grapevine that there's violence going on, that we're getting retribution against civilian youth who have been accosting military personnel in the Los Angeles area. I found lots of reports of people stationed all throughout Southern California taking buses to come into LA to kick ass, right? And so from the 4th to the 7th, the riot takes on an entirely different cast. It becomes much more racial in the sense that the first night, the military personnel who broke out, and again, I'll show you a map and you kind of get a sense of that, they were really attacking the neighborhoods around a particular armory where sailors and military personnel were stationed because of years of harassment. But in the 4th through the 7th, as these large groups kind of pour into Los Angeles, then it becomes very racial. They move down into South Central, which was heavily African-American. They move over to East LA, which is predominantly Mexican-American. So it changes as the nights go on. And then finally, by the 8th of June, it's over. And it's because by that point, the military officials finally took seriously that there was a problem, that something was going on that they needed to respond to. So they basically canceled leave. And that's when the whole thing ended at that point. All right, so next slide. So here's the first night of rioting. As I mentioned to you before, this is an actual picture from the riot. So you'll notice, for example, some military personnel walking around with basically 1x2 pieces of stick. They look like it might have been ripped off of what's that fence? There's a particular kind of fence that we have in the United States. I'm drawing a blank right now.
Not picket fence, no.
Picket fence, that's exactly it. It looks like it was ripped off of a picket fence or something. My point is that, this was pretty spontaneous. They had access to weapons if they wanted. This was spontaneous. They grabbed what they could from the street, and they're patrolling the street, looking for young people wearing jazz fashion. Now, I need to point this out. As we're talking about jazz fashion, it was not exclusive to African Americans, to Latino youth, even to immigrant Americans. It was a fashion that was largely a youth fashion across the color line. So you had white kids into jazz, just like today in the United States, and I imagine the same thing in the UK. You have white kids who are into hip hop, white kids. I mean, just think about the punk movement, for example, right? The whole Jamaican sound, right? It was not race-based.
No, I'd agree.
Right,
but it was class-based, I would say, in the UK. Class-based. It's always working class, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, in my early punk days, well, which was the same because I did rockabilly and punk. The punk was there were black punks, there were white punks, it was the love of the music and the love of the fashion. It wasn't a color thing. But anyway, I'm going into my misspent youth. But back to you.
You're absolutely correct. So it's a street culture that cuts across the color line. This becomes significant, though. That's the reason why I want to point this out. Now, the last thing I want to point out about this slide is that you notice slightly to your right, you see a civilian youth who's clearly not in uniform. In fact, you see a couple of civilian youth. Yeah. So this wasn't exclusively military versus civilian. It was much more complicated. It was very messy. But what they were doing is they were looking for young people who were wearing markers of jazz fashion. And we'll get into why in just a moment. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's the map I just wanted to show you very quickly. This is, for those of you who are familiar with Los Angeles, this might look very strange because there are no freeways, but this was Los Angeles before the freeways. And so again, if you're familiar with Los Angeles in the Chavez Ravine area where it's marked Elysian Park at the top of the map, this is where Dodger Stadium now sits, right? You'll see right below the oval where it says Chavez Ravine, there's the Naval Reserve Armory. And this was the time in 1942, 1943 when the U.S. military segregated. So when you're talking about an armory where military personnel are stationed, it's segregated. It's all white. But the neighborhoods between the armory and downtown, which is represented by Alpine Street and then Temple, these are all working class immigrant neighborhoods. Now there wasn't one particular minority group that was dominant. They were Italians, they were Jews, they were even Canadians for Pete's sake, right? But it's all pretty much working class and immigrant. And so what happened is that in the lead up, about 2 years before the riot breaks out, I found lots of police records that documented incidents of harassment that military personnel faced as they left the armory and headed downtown into downtown Los Angeles. They were harassed all the time on the streets. And they were basically working class kids saying, get out of here, right? This is my neighborhood, right? You don't belong here. So there are a couple of years of tensions building up against the military personnel that were stationed at that armory. And so that's why the first night on 3 June of 1943, when violence breaks out, it was localized to that stretch within that oval right there. That was the first night. As I mentioned earlier, as news spread that military personnel are now kicking ass, basically, that's when the subsequent nights, groups of military and civilians mobilized, and they head down into South Central, which is predominantly African American, and then they also head out into East LA, off to the right on the screen, and that's predominantly Mexican American. So the right is at the first night is an act of retribution. The second night's that's when race kind of kicks in,
right.
and there's much more of a racial aspect to it. So okay, next slide. All right, so this is just an image. I believe it was staged, but it's an image actually from the riot itself. It looks like this young man probably has something of a chest wound. He might have been stabbed. Again, I don't think it's staged. I mean, you notice his companion standing at the head of the table. Even in the 1940s, I don't think they would have allowed people in the ER to stand there and watch over with this very concerned look. Again, it's a stage photograph, but I do it did come out of the 1940s as a result of the riot. Next slide. This is another picture of probably a Mexican American youth with his concerned parents. There are no visible wounds there, but this leads me to kind of share with you one of the curious dynamics of the riot. No murders. I found no evidence at all from all the records I've looked at that any murder was associated with this riot. And to put that in context, in 1942 and throughout the United States, there were other riots that occurred, and they were race riots, and people died in Chicago, in Detroit. I think there was over 100 people that died as a result of rioting. So that's one of the things that makes the Zoot Suit riot in Los Angeles very odd. So no murder. No rape that I could document, and even no serious injury. I mean, a few scrapes here and there. There's a little property damage. So the damage that occurred in these nights of rioting all seemed to revolve around one thing, and that was fighting young people who wore the Zoot suit or the drape, stripping it off them, destroying the drape, either by ripping it up or burning it, and that was it. That was the whole focus of writing. So then the question becomes, why? Right? Why were people so fixated on this particular fashion? All right, so next slide then. All right, here's one thing I want to note. Another curious thing about, and this is where race then comes in. The response of the police force in Los Angeles, and the response. Do you think that they arrested the rioters, the people who were actually beating up other people? No, they didn't. They arrested the victims for their own protection. That was the rationale that was given, right? And so this is, again, another picture from the time period of young people who are put in a prison cell for their own protection. They weren't doing anything wrong other than being beaten up. And the one thing I want to point out is that if you look at this crowd, only one person, the one who's actually kneeling with the kind of fedora on, he's about the only one who could be identified as anyone wearing any element of jazz fashion. All the rest of the kids are just dressed like normal kids of the period. Yeah. Right? All right, so next slide. Oh, and my pointing this out as well is that, as we're talking about jazz fashion and the drape or the Zoot suit, it was an expensive article of clothing. And so most young people couldn't afford it. Really, we're talking in the small percentages, 0.5%, from my own trying to get a handle on how widespread this thing was. It really was fairly rare. So this is a picture of one of the next days after writing. These are young men who had been rounded up for being victims for their own protection. And I want to point out just a couple. You notice that many of them were not wearing a suit. Some of them are, and yes, they would qualify as drapes or Zoot suits, but most of them aren't. Again, I just want to point that out, that it was an item of jazz fashion, but most people didn't wear it because it was just too expensive. This was in the 1940s. You didn't have off the rack fashion. No, you can just walk into a department store and say, I will take that one, please, in my size. The drape was either bespoke So it was tailored for you, which cost a lot of money, and working class youth didn't have that kind of money. Or they would take their father's suits and have them cut down, so the shoulders are bigger, right? But it's again, it was an expensive item of clothing, so a lot of people couldn't afford to wear that. So, all right, next slide. So this is another picture from the night of rioting, and these are some military personnel with civilians. If you notice, they're on top of taxis. They're holding up an article of clothing, and this is what they would do: is they would really strip the clothing off of jazz aficionados. And so again, it raises the question, why? Why was the focus of their ire on clothing and not the individual? All right. So, but I will address that in just a moment. But I'll just show a picture. Okay. I think the next one is just showing then this is the last night of rioting. Military officials took seriously that there was a problem. They sent the military police out, shut down, leave, and then the whole thing is over by that point. All right. So next slide. This is another photograph that was taken from one of the nights of rioting. And I want you to take a look at these young people who are dressed. Not one of them are wearing any article of jazz fashion. They look like they could have been from the 1950s America. They're wearing Letterman's sweaters and Letterman's jackets. They're wearing dungarees or jeans. Again, they're dressed like ordinary young Americans of the 1940s. They're
or indeed the 50s or 60s. That photo
exactly.
is in a sense timeless, or even today in some ways. Those fashions they have come around the block so many times. And the question came up earlier about, and I'm sure you're going to bring this up yourself, about the Zoot suiters and whether or not they were 4F or avoiding service. But my observation from that photo is they are really young. I mean,
they are young.
They're young teens.
Yes. So yes, that is a great question about whether they were avoiding service or perhaps 4F. And that was all part of the criticism, right? Was that there was something suspect about them because they weren't doing their due diligence and being involved in the war. That was part of the criticism. Some of them, it's across the board, as you can imagine. Some were 4F. Some, because of prison records, were not allowed into the military. I mean, it's just a very complex picture. But that criticism, that suspicion that they were not patriotic, certainly was a part of the discourse and the public criticism of jazz fashion, that these people were actually opposing the war, and that wasn't the case at all. Jazz music. We're talking about swing jazz. Benny Goodman, for example. Jazz music really never transcended into war protest in the way that you see coming out of the 1960s, for example, where folk music combined with rock, and then you've got this anti-war protest. Jazz music just wasn't that way. It just was never a vehicle, but it was underground, right? It was a street fashion, and it was interracial. And the reason why this becomes an issue is that, this is a period of segregation. Segregation was a law of the land. And not only were the laws written that if you were racialized, you had to stay in your own corner, or that you had to defer to white privilege, but there were also unwritten laws. And this is what becomes important in this period is that as I did oral histories with a lot of young people that actually put on the jazz fashion, they found it empowering. I'll show you some slides of what I mean in just a moment, but let's go ahead and go to the next one. All right. So as I mentioned before, just to recap very quickly, what makes this riot very curious? No murder, no rape, no violent assault. There were a few hospitalizations. There was some property damage. And the focus of the riot was on destroying clothing, and it wasn't race specific. I have evidence of white kids wearing jazz fashion who got attacked by white mobs, right? So again, just to hark back to your days of the rock and the rockabilly and the punk movement as well, as you know, it was more generational. The criticism of punk, it wasn't race specific, it was generational. In other words, the parental generation would often look at punkers and go, what is happening with,
I had to leave the house with a big coat on, covering up my punk stuff, and had to do my hair up out of the house because I couldn't let my mum and dad see.
Exactly. That was a similar dynamic here. So it was not race specific. It was more generational than anything else. And so the question is, why were so many young people invested in jazz fashion? What did jazz as a cultural sign, what did it mean to young working class youth? And I think, part of the answer already, given your own background with rockabilly, with punk as well, is that it was empowering. It was an expression of experience that gave voice, that was important, that was missing in mainstream music and mainstream culture in the 80s and 90s. Same thing happening in the 1940s, right? This is why jazz was so important for working class youth. All right, next slide then. Now to the question, why the curious dynamic of this riot? Why did they de-zoot young people? And here's an actual photograph of 3 young people in detention. So I want to point out the man who's standing. If you notice right above his forehead and below his eye, you notice bruising. So he'd been beaten up already. His clothing had been destroyed. He's not wearing anything like a zoot suit, but at least his clothing was destroyed. There was something about his fashion, that elicited the ire of the mob. So the question is, why de-zooting? All right, so next slide then. So a couple things I want to mention in terms of context. Social events, particularly when society seems to break apart at the seams, there are always contextual issues that you have to understand about why that particular moment. So to begin with, one thing I want to notion is that, for the Allied powers, particularly the United States, and we're talking about June 1943, things were going badly for the United States. We really didn't start to win any major battles, to my knowledge, until the end of 1943. Up until this point, all of the news that you read about in the newspapers was not positive. And so again, from that perspective, at mid-war, we don't know how the war is going to end. It is not going well. There's no clear signs of victory. And so that kind of anxiety is an important part of the national context in the United States. Okay, now the next slide, please. Now, nationally speaking, what's happening in the United States? I can't overstate how much the war effort completely upended American society entirely. So all able-bodied men, if they were white especially, they were mobilized into the war effort and they were shipped out. They're gone, right? And that creates a labor vacuum about who do we have then to make the munitions that we need, right? The armaments. That's when women start to move into the workforce in unprecedented numbers. But not only women, but also African Americans. There were various trades that were segregated and that were not allowed for African Americans to move into. But because of the vacuum, you needed people to work. And so everything is changing dramatically. And you need to understand that. And there is always a social backlash. Whenever you have society that's changing rapidly, there's always a backlash. So that's one thing to keep in mind, right? Other thing I want to point out is that the demographics of Southern California, Los Angeles in particular, was changing dramatically, starting from 1910 all the way up into the war period. So to begin with, if you're familiar with The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck's novel, which then was turned into a movie, that is talking about a lot of working class whites who were displaced because of the Dust Bowl of the 1930s that hit the American Midwest. Many of them picked up, they no longer had farmland to use. They picked up and they moved out west into California. So you have this massive group of working class whites moving into Los Angeles and Southern California. On top of that, there's also a period in African American history that's known as the Great Migration. In other words, the movement out of the South for African Americans to find greener pastures, places that were not so prescribed by racial hostility. And so the Great Migration, starting about 1910 all the way to the 1950s, a lot of African Americans moving up north to Chicago, but also moving out west to Los Angeles. So you have large pockets now. Trying to paint for you a picture of a lot of working class whites moving in, a lot of African Americans moving in. And also coming up from south, there was the revolution in Mexico, 1910 to about 1921. There was still fighting going on until 1923. A lot of refugees came north to escape the violence, and they moved into Los Angeles. So now we're talking about a city within about a 30-year period, suddenly finds itself with a huge working class white population, huge African American population, huge Latin American or Latino population as well. And again, as I said before, this is part of just social psychology, is whenever there are rapid changes in an area or society, there's always a pushback. There's always a conservative.
And of course, everything is increased by the war. Mobilization of units, army camps being set up, whole swathes of units moving across country, the industrialization, people moving into cities for the factories, it just made the whole situation more people, all sorts of people meeting each other who had not met each other before in large cities.
Yes.
And I include UK and everywhere else involved in that as well. Australia, the same thing.
Yes, many countries are around the same thing happens. It's not unique to the United States. It's when there's rapid demographic change, immigrants coming in, there's always a counter response to that. And it's not always pretty. And the violence can be a part of that. And that's part of what I'm trying to portray now as far as kind of the build up to this riot. Now, the last thing I want to point out, though, as I mentioned before, was that segregation was the law of the land. This was a practice, deference to white privilege. And this becomes crucial. So let's go to the next slide. Now, one thing I want to note about, now my focus is on Los Angeles in particular, but this was not only nationwide, but the dynamic happens also internationally as well. This underground culture of jazz, and the reason why I call it underground culture is because if we went back in time in the 1940s and you turned on the radio, this is your main medium of news and of music as well. It was the radio. If you turned it on and listened to the top 40 songs of what was popular in the nation, you would never hear jazz, ever. It was called race music. Yep. And it was played on pirate stations. So this was underground. This was not what respectable people listened to. Dancing, the swing jazz was not what respectable people danced to. This is a period when people are still doing the foxtrot and the waltz, and the music is all very kind of melodic and sedate. And then along comes jazz, particularly swing jazz, where there's a beat and you're swinging your partner around, you're throwing her over your head, and all these kinds of movements with the body, which again, for the older generation, they're looking at this and they literally called it jungle music. Yeah, they spoke about this wild expression, and this, like I mentioned before, the same way in which kind of the parental generation responded to I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank now. Punk, right? In other words, with great alarm that society is collapsing around us because of this expression. You had the same reaction in the 1940s to jazz, right? But there are three things I want to point out very, very quickly about jazz. This underground, the street movement as well. It was very visual in terms of the clothing, the way that they wore their hair. It was in terms of the social impact. It was countercultural. What I mean by that is the very, very fact that it was interracial and even transracial. In other words, in the jazz clubs that were kind of like speakeasies, right, of the 1920s, where you had to knock on the door to be let in. In these clubs, it didn't matter what color you were. What mattered was whether you can show your soul, whether you could blow your horn on the stage, or whether you could dance on the floor. And so you had race mixing going on at a time when segregation was the law of the land. And so it was countercultural in that way. And there were a lot of people very invested in maintaining these power dynamics that looked with great alarm at the youth who were, again, upending the social expectations of society, right? So this is how it was countercultural.
And just to jump in, Eduardo, because there's conversation in the sidebar about that swing music was popular on the radio, but we're talking about the cross. There's mainstream swing and there's underground swing. And again, in the 1950s, we forget that Elvis was being played on the radio, but Pat Boone was on the radio. You look at the charts in the 1950s, Carousel and things like that were the best-selling albums. Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and Gene Vincent, they weren't selling lots of that. We think that was what people was listening to now, but they weren't. And the same thing applies to the 1940s. When you go to a 1940s event in the UK, the soundtrack is all Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller and Woody Herman. But actually, most of the BBC were playing light opera and very traditional kind of almost 1920s Edward music. So we've come to think of the radio waves being the music that we look back on fondly, but actually there was a lot of dross on mainstream radio in the US and in the UK, and we've falsely remembered it being more progressive than it was.
Yes. Thank you for that nuance as well. And our viewers is absolutely right that swing music was popular in the 1940s. But the thing I want to point out, though, is it was appropriated by Benny Goodman, as you mentioned before. Yeah. Benny Goodman was in many ways kind of the Elvis of his day. So in other words, this African-American, Jewish-American musical form was appropriated and made appropriate for the mainstream audiences, right? And so, yes, the music that was really energizing young people. These are Black artists, these are Jewish artists, these are Italian artists as well. And this is not what you see kind of in the mainstream in the 1940s as well. So thank you for that nuance. All right, let's go on to the next slide then. Here's a thing I want to point out about how jazz, I'd mentioned before that the fashion was empowering for a lot of young people. I want you to notice, I love this picture. This was taken in 1942 in East LA. And I want you to notice that to begin with, the collars that are popped up. And, you know, in many generations, even to this day, if somebody pops up the collar of their jacket, it's not saying that they're cold. I mean, you can't be cold, but it's often a way of accentuating the fashion and kind of calling notice to yourself. The other thing I want to point out is if you notice the ratio of the shoulders to the hips to the stride, and what we're seeing here with this photograph is a strut. If we could do this in real life, they're strutting. Their shoulders are thrown back, heads held high, and they're strutting. Why are they strutting? Because they feel empowered by the fashion. And in a period of segregation, when the norm of segregation was that you're supposed to defer to whiteness, you're not supposed to call attention to yourself, because if you do, there are consequences. For young people to put on this fashion and stand up straight and strut down the road, you are now challenging the norms of society, the unwritten norms of society. And I also found a number of police reports where a lot of civilians in Los Angeles were writing in complaints of these uppity, and this was a modern term, but this was the sense of trying to get these uppity minority youth who refused to step off the sidewalk to allow a white couple to go by, right? I mean, that is a direct affront to racial privilege. In fact, there were some reports of them actually bumping shoulders with white people as they walked down the sidewalk. And again, in the context of segregation, this is an affront, right? This is a challenge. And it wasn't that the Zoot suit itself was criminal, but it was empowering. And it empowered them, particularly for second generation immigrant youth, to essentially say, look at me on my own terms and deal with me on my own terms. I have a space too here in the society. They were refusing to accept the social space that had been defined by generations of segregation. And they were asserting their place. And this clothing was simply one way of doing that, right? That's why this element or this item of clothing became so controversial and even criminalized during this period. There were people who immediately, they saw the fashion, they thought these guys are up to no good. In the same way, I would argue, I'm not sure how it was in the UK, but I do know a little bit about punk history as well, is that, again, if you walked out of the house and someone saw you in punk fashion, immediately they would suspect that you're up to no good. There's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
It was the same reaction to jazz and this particular fashion. There's something wrong with you. You're up to no good. And in some ways they were, but it wasn't in a what I would call a bona fide criminal way. They weren't thieves, for example. They weren't out, breaking into property. They were asserting their place, but they were doing it at a time when the laws were written that the assertion of place for racialized individuals was wrong, right? It is an
and again, you're making the distinction between, you know, people in their 30s and 40s listening to the safe end of swing on a popular radio show, and this underground street jazz swing with attitude. It's about the whole movement behind it, not just listening to a bit of music. We're again, it's like I'm going to bring up punk. The Sex Pistols were the manufactured side of it. It wasn't what, when I was going, I mean, I was too young for the original punk, but I kind of the second wave of punk. What people listened to in the clubs wasn't what was making the charts. So it's and it was the underground stuff was where the tension was, and that's where the police would check out would be monitoring the underground clubs, not the mainstream stuff. That's my connection with it. It seems there's a huge cultural and similarity between these two movements.
Yes, that comparison is spot on. Thank you. Yes. Brilliant. All right, next slide, please. All right, so so as I mentioned before, again, by kind of summation of what I just mentioned before, what made the clothing, the fashion political is that it played out against the ethos of segregation. And that young people, when they put themselves into this fashion, they had some understanding of what they were doing. They knew their parents didn't appreciate or didn't approve of what they were wearing, but it was their statement of who they were. And that assertion of place, particularly for working class youth, and if you were racialized as well, that was a challenge to the status quo, right? That's what made this political as well. Let's go to the next slide. I hope I included, oh, I didn't do this. Can we go back for just a moment? And I apologize. I may not have included this as well. I want you to take a look beyond the wording at the image behind you. And the young woman to the left, she is actually wearing a drape. And this is part of the way in which then it becomes political. Women didn't wear pants in the 1940s. If it was part of your work site experience or requirement, then yes, you wore pants. But out in public, women didn't wear pants. That was highly, highly scandalous, to be gender bending in effect, right? To be putting on men's clothing. This young woman to the left, she has, I hope I included a fuller picture where you can actually see it, but she's wearing the full drape. So again, for a young woman to be wearing man's clothing in public, that is a challenge to the norms of society. Two other things I want to mention, the young women to the right as well, their hair. Big hair has always been sexualized certainly in American culture, and the fact that this is a mode of expression. Look, it's not unusual for young people to experiment with sexuality, and you know their bodies and themselves as well. But there was a lot of press in the period that looked upon that hair as a marker of women who were sexually promiscuous, which again, against the norm of society, this was wrong, right? These are not the young women that you want your young man dating. And the last thing I want to say is that if we could see, and I will kick myself if I left the full picture out. I don't think
you did put it in, unfortunately, but never mind.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll just describe it for you. Their skirts really fall up at the knee. And so today in 2023.
Scandalous, honestly. God damn. We have to put a warning on this video.
You're right. In today, that is a conservative length, but in the 1940s, to show that much leg, you're calling attention to yourself. You are advertising your availability, and that's how people responded to the fashion of young people. And again, it's normal for many generations to simply explore their sexuality, to explore their identities, to push boundaries. That's normal. But in the 1940s, again, when you have a rapidly changing society, and there is this larger pushback that we're losing something that was very precious. We need to keep the lid on social change. These young people and their fashion, they became one of the victims of that effort to kind of put the genie back in the bottle, if you will. All right, so next slide. All right. So again, I'd already mentioned this as well, is that there was a lot of literature during the period that accused the young people, particularly in the Mexican-American communities, the barrios, of being lawless. And it really comes down to how you define what lawful meant. And, I would agree that they were lawless in the sense that they refused to defer to the norms of segregation. And there's lots of evidence that they were not buying into what America was requiring of racialized individuals at the time. And they were essentially revolting against segregation, but they were doing it on the street level through their presentation, through their assertion of their place in public. But there were also efforts of activists during this period to try and undo racialized laws that restricted voting and restricted access to various places as well. So what's happening during this period of social change is you have a lot of people who have been racialized, who have been victims of segregation, pushing back against these laws and really trying to change things to be much more inclusive than what they were. So no, I don't agree with the characterization in the 1940s that they were lawless, but I do agree that they were challenging the laws, and a lot of people saw those challenges as being lawless. All right, next slide. All right, so now back to the question about why did the riot break out to begin with, right? So my conclusion is I've tried to figure out, try to kind of work through these very complicated dynamics that are going on during this period. I do believe that, as I'd mentioned before, that many civilians and many military as well across the color line, this wasn't just all white against people of color. You had racialized people in the United States at this time who looked upon jazz culture as something very scandalous and inappropriate, right? So again, it's not racialized in that way, but there was a belief that this growing street culture was undermining public safety, and public safety in the way that, again, that kids on the street, they were not behaving like they were supposed to behave, right? Again, to hark back to punk, right? There was a lot of that same reaction, is that punk youth were not behaving in the way that proper society wanted you to behave, right?
And in the middle of a war, it's peak uniformity, and I mean that literally and metaphorically. In that, lots of people are wearing khaki in various shades, but also there's a uniform attitude. And I was going to say earlier, I wonder whether any of this comes from the fact that when I have Americans coming to Normandy and say, they talk about the Battle of Britain or something, they'll often say, "Oh, well, Americans, we were really behind the war effort in 1940." And I politely say, "No, you weren't. Not really. Your country was completely divided in the early part of the war about whether or not to get involved. But clearly, by Pearl Harbor and by 42, the war effort." Everybody is pretty much behind the war effort, and now that's the focus. Everyone is moving in that same direction, and anything that seems to not represent that uniformity would then be seen as subversive or dangerous or scary.
Yes, thank you for that. Let me just share with you an experience that I had in the post 9/11 period in the United States, and it was this very interesting dynamic for me to witness. I was working in Washington, D.C. at the time, and a lot of people, they're focused in on the Twin Towers and what happened there. But the Pentagon was also attacked by one of the jets. And what was interesting to me in the weeks and months that followed, as I was working in DC and writing the Metro, what I noticed is that suddenly everyone started putting on pins of the American flag. And it was, again, it was a symbolic expression of your patriotism. And for someone to not have it, no one was singled out. I never witnessed that, but you certainly wondered why somebody was not putting on the pin and saying that we're behind the nation, right? It's again similar dynamic during World War II. The focus was, it's an all-out effort to pursue this military conflict. And so conformity was also part of the unwritten expectations of society at the time. So anyone who pushed against that idea of conformity, they're going to pay for it, right? So that's part of it. There was also another element as well, is that, again, as I'd mentioned before, that, all able-bodied men were mobilized for the war in one way or the other. And even though for the police force, they were a protected category, there were many who nonetheless volunteered and went on. And it was acknowledged in Los Angeles during the time that the police force was down to a kind of a skeleton crew level. And there was a lot of press, a lot of letters to the editor, a lot of concern expressed that with a small police force, the city was ripe for abuse, that criminalization would happen at some point because you didn't have the police force. So there was part of that concern. And the reason why that becomes important is that my conclusion is that this riot happened because people wanted, as I said before, they wanted to put the genie back into the bottle of social change. There were many who invested in showing that, yes, we can keep criminality down. We can keep these disreputable elements down. We can put them in their place. We can push back against those who are trying to undermine segregation. And so the riot, as I said before, was this multifaceted event. It wasn't just all one group against another. There were lots of layers that came into this, that kind of wove into this particular dynamic. And that's really what I was trying to identify in my work that's called Murder at the Sleepy Lagoon.
Yeah,
so
I should mention, folks, the link to Eduardo's books book is in the description below. You can find it in all your usual bookstores and online, etc., etc.
Thank you for that. Let's see what the next slide is. Yeah, now again, to summarize now, what was behind this very curious dynamic of the riot? Why did they de-Zoot? Well, again, wearing this jazz fashion was a very visible symbol that you are different. And so to strip it off of you and to destroy it right in front of you was a way of saying, no, you're not different. Things are going to remain the same, right? And so I think it was very symbolic. And yes, there were people who were beaten up if they refused to take their clothing off. So there was violence that happened. But I really think it was this effort to reassert the status quo and to fight against the changes that were taking place before their eyes, right? And so as I mentioned earlier, jazz culture was subversive and countercultural. Drapes were these very public displays of kind of newfound wealth. There's a lot of working class kids, and they moved into the factories. Suddenly they had disposable income in a way that they didn't have before. And what did they do is they went out and they spent it on things that young people would want to spend on. And, you know, what they were into, the music, the clothing, the whole thing as well. And so by destroying that expression of newfound wealth was also a way of destroying putting people of color back in their place, if that makes sense. And so that's really what I think this was about. This is why the riot revolved around this very curious dynamic of destroying clothing. It was a way of stopping change. It was a way of destroying the symbols of change and trying to put people back into their place. Working class youth back in your place. Things are not going to change, not on my watch, right? And so that's why I think this riot took on this very, very curious dynamic.
And it's interesting because someone just said, unpatriotic came up in the sidebar. But one of the things I always think about the conflict, such as the Second World War, is that different people saw it as a different way forward. My best mate here in Normandy, Colin, his family's grandfather saw it as a chance for a better life. The working class fighting. Of course, you're fighting against the Nazis, you're fighting against evil, but you're also fighting for your own social betterment. So patriotism, a form of patriotism, can be wanting something better for your country that your country has not reached a certain point. It doesn't mean you're unpatriotic. It means that you have a vision for something that is not yet there. And of course, segregation was a terrible policy. And the fact that the U.S. Army was fighting the Nazis with a segregated army is a discussion, a topic that's come up numerous times on this channel. And it's obviously very contradictory, the fact that it was, but that's how it was, and that's why some people were fighting the war. They were fighting for multiple reasons, and as you've explained, the Zoot Suit riots, there's more than one seed to it.
Yes, thank you for that. As a matter of fact, there were some of the voices of the young people who were jazz aficionados and that were involved in this, who actually did say, we're patriotic too. We're fighting, our brothers are fighting off in the war as well, but we're fighting for a different future, right? And that's what I find interesting about this particular moment is that this youth culture, this street culture, which was much more on what was inside you as opposed to what your exterior looked like, that pointed to a better future, and it pointed to changes that were going to come. Now, I'm not trying to say that everything is all now wine and roses here in the United States, but at least we no longer have these segregation laws in the way that existed in the 1940s. So in a lot of ways, this street culture was a foreshadowing of what was to come, and it was a different kind of world that looked at different kinds of things in terms of self-expression, but also place in public and in society as well.
Right.
Do I have another slide?
Summary, yeah, that's it. Summary.
Yeah, that was it. Okay, that was my last slide. So again, I apologize that I left out that one image of those four young people.
Well, people can search online. They can buy your book, and they can find it there. And
thank you.
So, well, it's been really, really rewarding and enlightening, and I've learned a lot. But I want to conclude, if we may, by just give us a little breakdown of the historiography of how this has been talked about over the last 80 years. I mean, I know we could do another hour on that, but because Randolph Hearst was criticized for his coverage of it back at the time. But has it gone through a couple of clear kind of phases of how it's been talked about? Who has claimed it as clearly my knowledge of it was basically a military against Latinos. That's was my basic single understanding of which clearly it's not. It's much more about the Zoot suit. But just kind of briefly kind of take us through the phases and where we are now, 80 years on.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And so, as I mentioned earlier, about in terms of my first exposure was this musical, which then became a movie as well. And it's certainly written from that perspective that it's all white people against Mexican Americans. They hate us. I mean, that's basically the essence of the story. So what's interesting is that, in 1943, I didn't have a chance to get into the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial. That's a whole other hour. But I just want to mention that there was a murder trial that happened about 6 months before the riot. It's not connected to the riot in any direct causal way. But what came out of that was a pamphlet that was written by a Hollywood screenwriter to try and raise money for the appeal effort of these young people who were accused of murder and convicted of murder, despite there being no eyewitness or a murder weapon or even motivation proved. I mean, the state had nothing, and they were still convicted. So there was this larger effort going on, and this pamphlet, I think there was about 40 pages. It was written by a screenwriter, and as you can imagine, it was written in this very dramatic, chiaroscuro, black and white way, good versus evil. And part of the evil was William Randolph Hearst, right, and his newspapers. And that pamphlet became the inspiration then for how the musical then was created in the 1970s called Zoot Suit, which then became the music as well. I'm sorry, the movie as well. So that interpretation continued on for a very, very long time, that what was happening in the Zoot Suit was a race riot. And it was a race riot of white people against Mexican Americans. And part of what I've tried to bring forward is that it was much more complicated than that. I'm not disregarding the reality of racism. It was there. It was simply one of the strands of multiple strands that came together in this moment of social conflict. And so my effort was really trying to uncover these other elements that were equally at work during this period. So I don't know how successful my work has been. It's been around for 20 years, but mythology dies hard, as you can imagine.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, you're talking to a guy who has to combat the myths about the Battle of Britain and Market Garden and Normandy, and that still keep on going and enduring. Right. But it's interesting having the conversations. And a race riot, it's a convenient label to put on something that gives everybody an instant understanding of it, even if it's as we're now realizing somewhat flawed, but it's an easy category to put something into. And what you've shown us is that it's hard to put this into one single category. It's got lots of strands to it, and the fact, like anything else that happens, it's a sort of a tinderbox of a perfect storm of things going on. There's someone at Great Dominion just said, most likely there was also a Jody man element to this, i.e. servicemen worrying about these guys messing around with their women while they're away at war. That's a potential thread there, but I think they're so young, the ones in the photos. I don't know. What's your reaction to that?
That's a very interesting observation. I think there was a sexual tension within the dynamic, the confrontations that kind of blew up during this particular moment. But I don't think it was necessarily heterosexual. What I found really interesting is getting back to these police reports that I found, there were a lot of derogatory same-sex comments that were made from civilian kids to military men. American sailors had that reputation of being engaged in same-sex activity as well when they're long deployments. And so there was a lot of gay bashing in the language, going back and forth between the military men versus the civilian youth and vice versa as well. So I don't think it was so much, again, in this period of entrenched segregation, these interracial relationships, I don't think that so much came to the fore. What was much more obvious was this gay bashing that was going back and forth, right? You do this, no, we don't, and you know.
It's complex because, yeah, I'm thinking about punk again. I mean, punk, from my point of view, it was mostly male. There were a few female punks, but it's mostly a male thing. But we were putting green and pink and yellow in our hair. I wore eyeliner. So in a weird way, I'm making it both a masculine statement, but in a kind of weird feminine, androgynous kind of way. This is, punk was around at the same era as David Bowie doing all his makeup stuff, coming out of glam rock, and Kiss were doing it. It's a really complicated. Now I'm thinking about it, the whole, because the Zoot Suitor, it is both a masculine demonstration and also feminine at the same time. It's paradox. It depends what you perceive it is as. If you're someone from outside of it, you're seeing it as threatening. You're definitely seeing it as threatening. Anybody who has power, and it's an empowerment thing. Anybody you feel is demonstrating power can be scary to the observer.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think that's the connecting thread I'm seeing.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree with you. And what gives it a particular punch is when it's a period of social stress.
Yeah.
Which World War II was. Yeah. Now in the UK, of course, you had Thatcherism. I mean, you had your own social stress. If things are going good and young people are experimenting with their presentation and boundaries of gender, things like that, I think people are pretty much live and let live. But when there are moments of unique stress on society, there's a natural kind of conservative reaction on the part of many people.
No, I mean, I did a show about swing music back in the very early days of World War II. We had Ray Gelato and English, Italian swing artists, and I had one of the Cherry Popping Daddies was on, and things like that. We talked about the music, because music that makes a difference, that is remembered for being activist, is because there's something troubling the country it starts in. I mean, as you say, punk didn't last very long because Thatcher came, Labour, the strikes ended, the financial. I didn't like Thatcher, but she came on and changed things, and punk. There was no need for punk anymore. The kind of rock and roll revolution was short-lived because the need for it went away. I mean, you could probably make the same case about hip-hop. When that started, there was a statement being made that then the statement didn't need to be made anymore. But anyway, it's a fascinating conversation. I think we should have you back, because I want to get more into the Latino history in World War II, African American history as well, because it's fascinating, and it's so often it's talked about in very simple terms. And I like to we like on this channel the nuance. We like to not necessarily draw any firm conclusions. We go, but it's just been an interesting conversation, and we leave it there.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to spend this hour with you.
Brilliant. Well, Eduardo, I can't wait to have you back again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for giving your time to us. And folks, that's it for a few days, because I've got all my D-Day stuff going on. I'll be scheduling some shows as soon as I'm finished, sometime about June the 8th, 9th, 10th. I don't know when it'll be, but thanks for watching. And in the meantime, check out our sister channel, World War I TV. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, viewers. I will see you again after the anniversary. Bye.
Bye-bye.